great pleasure to be with you and a great honor to be awarded to be given this award from a group that I've admired enormously for many years for the remarkable and quite crucial work that it's been doing. And I would like to say a little about that and also put it in what I think is a useful context. We're in the middle of this quadrennial extravaganza, which is mostly irritating, but has some good sides. One is that I do think it provides a relevant context for discussing the critically important work that CPE has been doing and must continue to do. And we can also learn something from it about how the country works, both the political and social and economic aspects. I mean, it's obvious to anybody who pays any attention that the elections are mainly a huge PR operation. They're run by the PR industry, and they follow its guidelines. And they understand it very well. So you may recall that after the 2008 election, immediately after the election, there was the annual meeting of the Advertising Association, National Advertising Association. Every year they give an award for the most successful marketing campaign of the year. In 2008, they gave it to Obama. He beat out Apple Computer. And the business press was kind of interesting, the Financial Times and so on. They reported the responses of executives to this. They were quite euphoric about it. They said Obama has presented us with a new model for deluding people. We were following the Reagan model. We thought that was a pretty good one, but Obama's now presented a new one. So that's the one we're going to try to make use of from now on. I don't usually quote Sarah Palin, but she had something to say about this, which I'm sure you heard, which wasn't totally false. She asked, where's all this hopey, changey stuff? You know, well, it's a good question. By looking into the industry and how it developed and what it does, we can gain a good deal of understanding of the political process and how to confront the shredding of what little remains of political democracy, and not least in the economic dimension, which is tightly related to it. The primary functions of the PR industry were very clearly and frankly laid out by its founders. It was founded pretty much in the 1920s. The leading guru of the industry was Edward Bernays. He was no reactionary. He was a Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberal, and a pretty decent person. And he was, in fact, expressing views which are quite standard in those circles. He wrote it in a book which had the honest title, Propaganda. This is the 1920s. The term at that time was used honestly. Now has a bad connotation, so it's not used anymore. In his book, Propaganda, which was a manual for the industry, he explained what it's about, and I'll just quote it. He says the goal of the industry should be conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses, an important element in democratic society. But clearly it is the intelligent minorities which need to make use of propaganda continuously and systematically, because only they understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses and are therefore able to pull the wires which control the public mind, to mold the mind of the masses so that they will throw their strength in the desired direction, the direction understood by the intelligent minorities who must, as he said, regiment the public mind every bit as much as an army regiments the bodies of its soldiers. That's the noble mission of the PR industry, and this process of what he called engineering consent is the very essence of the democratic process. He wrote that when he was being honored for his contributions by the American Psychological Association. Well, Bernays was not only a Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy progressive, but as I said, also a decent person and an intelligent person. It's hard to believe that he was unaware that the intelligent minorities are granted the opportunity to control the public mind in the desired direction only when that's the direction approved by the paymasters. And like other decent persons, he was caught in the structure of the prevailing socioeconomic system. The industry obviously works for those who can pay. Bernays' first major success back in the 1920s was to run a campaign to induce women to smoke. That was a contribution to what one recent technical study calls the tobacco holocaust. It estimates that the industry was responsible for 100 million deaths worldwide in the past century and a projected billion deaths by 2100, and calculated that the industry kills one person for every $10,000 in profit. That was his first major contribution. The second one, the other one that he's known for, is in working for the United Fruit Company, where he was molding the mind of the masses to support the military coup in Guatemala in 1954. That wasn't quite as successful. They only killed a couple 100,000 people and left a ruined country ever since. In fact, to this day, people are still fleeing from the Mayan highlands from the virtual genocide carried out there under Reagan's war. Bernays was particularly successful in molding the minds of the free press. He was working together with Thomas McCann, who was the press director for the company, the fruit company. And McCann was asked later whether he thought it was appropriate to work together with Bernays to tell outrageous lies to the media to try to prepare the background for the military coup that took place with all its horrible consequences. And he said he thought that it was because, as he put it, the media were so eager for the experience. He didn't want to deprive them. Well, that's the liberal progressive end of the spectrum. You can move over to the Karl Rove, Koch brothers end, and maybe you can find some differences, but they're not phenomenal. Well, when the PR industry runs elections, they, of course, work for the funders, which is not surprising, and it's by no means new. In fact, it goes back before the industry was founded in the 1920s. So if you go back roughly a century, you recall the great campaign organizer and rich businessman, Mark Hanna, who was asked once what was necessary for a political campaign. And his answer was that there are three things. The first one is money. The second one is money. And the third, he said, I can't remember. But that was during an earlier Gilded Age. And by now there's quite good scholarship on how this works. Some of the best work I know is by Tom Ferguson at the other UMass. His investment theory of politics, I think, gives very convincing evidence that over a long period, more than a century, you can pretty well predict the policies that an elected government's going to follow just by looking at the concentration of campaign funding. He's brought it right to the present. So what's new is, what's happening now is not new in any fundamental way, but it actually, I think it is one of those cases where quantity turns into quality. It's dramatically different in that respect. So it's natural that the elections should be farcical displays run by the PR agencies in the interests of concentrated private power. And it's also very natural that they should keep away from issues, which they do very successfully. It's important not to bring up issues, and the reason is just what Bernays pointed out almost 100 years ago. The ignorant people don't understand. And in order to get them into the desired direction, you've got to continue to figure out ways to delude and marginalize them. And that's evident, in fact, from studies of public opinion, which are pretty good and informative. U.S. opinion is better studied than anywhere in the world, I presume, because the business world, which funds the studies, wants to keep its finger on the public pulse. If you want to learn how to control and misdirect people in the desired direction, you got to know what they're thinking. Well, the primary business of the industry, of course, is commercial advertising. And here its basic commitment is quite simple. It's to destroy markets. Anyone who's taken an economics course, except maybe if it's taught here, learns that a market is based on informed consumers making rational choices. And then come some interesting theorems that you can prove from that. Anyone who's turned on a television set knows that business is spending hundreds of billions of dollars a year to prevent that. If advertisements were designed to create informed consumers making rational choices, then say, GM or toothpaste maker or whatever would put up a short ad with the description of the project, maybe some quotes from Consumer Reports to guide people, but that's not exactly what you see. What you see is dedicated efforts to create uninformed consumers who will make irrational choices, and that's understandable. And when the industry turns to the quadrennial task of running elections, they do the same thing. They use their talents to create uninformed citizens who will make irrational choices, which is what we watch every day. And there's no need to elaborate on how it works, but it's worth bearing in mind that it's highly functional and very rational. The intelligent minorities should be dedicated to the task, not just in the liberal democracies, of course, although it takes a different form there. In fact, if you look at the history of the PR industry, it's kind of interesting. It developed first in the most free countries in the world, in England and the United States, for good reasons, which were stated. It was becoming harder to control people by force. So you had to turn to the next best method, namely controlling their opinions and attitudes, or at least figuring out ways to marginalize them. Go back to the business literature of the 1920s. It said it's important to drive people to the insignificant things of life, like fashionable consumption. And insofar as they're concerned with things that are happening in the world, to follow the directives that Edward Bernays spelled out so well. And there are some successes in creating uninformed voters who make irrational choices. So one poll that came out a couple of days ago of Southern whites is illustrative. A poll about what they think about taxes. And it turns out they, by substantial majority, think that there should be higher taxes for the very wealthy. But by the same majority, they think Romney's programs on taxes are better than those of the Democrats. Well, that's a success. There are careful studies of the sector of the population that calls themselves, that answers poll questions by saying that they're in favor of small government, get the government off my back. You look at them, they're basically social democrats. They're in favor of increasing spending on education, on health, help for women with dependent children, but not welfare, because welfare was effectively demonized by Reagan on racist grounds and then pretty well killed by Clinton. Foreign aid is an interesting question, that a lot of polling questions on that. It turns out that when people are asked what they think about foreign aid, overwhelmingly they say it's way too high. We're giving everything away to the undeserving poor. And when they're asked what they think it ought to be, they give a figure which is far higher than it is. But that's, again, success in creating uninformed people making irrational choices. The most interesting case right now is about the basic issues facing the country domestically. It's pretty obvious that the basic issue is jobs, but that's not what the financial institutions care about. They care about the eventual, sometime in the undetectable future, possibility of inflation, which is bad for lenders. So they want you to worry about deficits. And if you look at the press and the elections and so on, there's just a drumbeat of propaganda about elections and very little that makes any sense, at least, about jobs. Now, it's not that the political leaders don't understand this. So, for example, Christiana Romer, chair of Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, argued that this is the time, as she put it, to press the accelerator. We can worry about the brake later. And that's accepted by the business press. So Bloomberg Businessweek uses the same metaphor, says that's what we ought to do. Same with the London Financial Times, the major world newspaper. But the paymasters have different priorities, and they would prefer to delude the public about the horrendous problem of the deficit, ultimately the debt. Well, there are estimated 23 million people unemployed or underemployed or given up, and that's a huge problem. It utterly dwarfs the deficit. It's a human problem because it's destroying lives, and on an enormous scale. It's also an economic problem. It's depriving the country of their contributions. So there's really something deeply wrong with a society where there's huge resources available, a huge number of people wanting to work, tremendous amount of work that has to be done, but it just can't put them together. That should be the central component of any campaign that was concerned with informed voters making rational choices, but it's totally missing, not a word in the campaigns, the media, elsewhere, which simply means they're doing their job. They're doing the job that Bernays described very well. The public is understandably quite confused, but actually public instincts are often pretty sensible, already indicated part of it. There are actually good studies on all of this, on the gaps between public opinion and public policy. Some of the best ones have been carried out by Ben Page at Northwestern and his colleagues. You take a look at the polls that regularly, depends how questions are asked always, but typically in the recent years, people have said that jobs are a lot more important than the deficit. There are some studies of people's attitude toward the deficit and what to do about it. Actually, the best one is run by World Public Opinion, most detailed one. Director Stephen Cull, I'll quote his conclusion. He says, clearly both the administration and the Republican-led House are out of step with the public's values and priorities with regard to the budget. The biggest difference in spending is that the public favors deep cuts in defense spending, more spending on job training, education, and pollution, higher taxes, especially on the rich, all the opposite of policy. The gap gets particularly extreme when you look at people like Paul Ryan, who in my opinion is the most dangerous person in the political sphere, and that's the fault of the liberals because they take him seriously. He's considered the great thinker because he carries around pages that have some numbers on them, so you got to be a big thinker to do that. But his position is interesting. I don't want to give a biased view, so I'll quote the Wall Street Journal. This is the Wall Street Journal on Ryan's budget proposals. Under Mr. Ryan's plan, the Congressional Budget Office estimates spending on each 67-year-old Medicare beneficiary in 2050 would be 42% lower than the cost of maintaining the status quo. On Medicaid, spending would be 78% lower. And the author adds, that's not a typo. Mr. Ryan doesn't hide his priorities. He puts numbers on them. Like Mr. Reagan, he emphasizes the import of defense spending. His budget calls for spending $16 billion, or 3% more on defense in 2017 than Mr. Obama's budget. In short, radically, not only radically different from what the public wants, but exactly the opposite, including the most conservative sectors, like Tea Party people, say the opposite. So perfectly naturally, the campaign has to suppress issues in favor of glitz and delusion, like on television ads. It's often said these days that there aren't any more moderate Republicans, but that's not quite accurate. There are plenty of moderate Republicans. They're just named differently. They're called New Democrats. And they've actually been driving the Democratic Party in pretty much the same direction, deeper into corporate pockets, not quite with as much gusto and dedication as the Republicans, but same processes, same reasons. So therefore, they too have to suppress issues. And the PR understands it all very well, as the 2008 prize to Obama illustrates. The gap is quite normal on many issues, including some related to the deficit. I mean, it's been pointed out by good economists, Dean Baker's discussed it often, that if the United States had a healthcare system like other industrial countries, which is not exactly a utopian dream, there wouldn't be any deficit. In fact, we'd be moving towards a surplus. I'm sure you know the data about that. It's a dysfunctional system. It's an international scandal. Over twice the per capita expenditures of OECD countries, and relatively poor outcomes, and plenty of people just left out. The public has been in favor of a national health care system for a long time. It's been interesting to see the occasional comments on it. So in 2004, the election 2004, the last debate, late October, Kerry-Bush debate, was on domestic policy. And the New York Times had an interesting article on it. It pointed out that neither candidate brought up health policy, 2004. And it said they recognized that the public's pretty much in favor of something like national health care, but they said there's no political support for it, which is true. Political support means banks, insurance companies, rich CEOs and so on, and they don't want it. It changed in 2008 slightly for reasons that I think are understandable. American manufacturing industry is being hit very hard by the dysfunctional health system. So GM, for example, estimated that it costs them $1,200 more to produce a car in Detroit than across the border in Windsor, Canada, simply because the healthcare system's more effective. Well, manufacturing industry isn't as powerful as it used to be, but has some kind of clout, and as a result, something entered the 2008 and since campaign with some form of healthcare system, which is, in fact, an improvement over the totally dysfunctional system that exists, but is far below what it ought to be, or even what the public wants. That was pretty evident in the two crucial issues. One, the public option, which was the last residue of the public concern for a national system. That was just given away. Obama didn't even try, even though there was an overwhelming, about 2-to-1 majority in favor of it. Even more striking, which didn't get much coverage, was the giveaway to the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, there are many of them, like TRIPS and many other things, but one very striking one is a law which I think exists only in the United States, which bars the government from negotiating drug prices, except for the VA, which is the one part of the system that works because it's nationalized, and much lower drug prices, much better outcomes, and so on. So there was a poll by Kaiser right at the time, and they found that 85% of the public is in favor of getting rid of this provision so that the government can negotiate drug prices just like the Pentagon negotiates, paperclip prices. But that wasn't even considered. It was just like not even possible to mention it. Well, and as I say, a very, non-utopian policies like picking up the programs of every other comparable country would end the famous deficit and open the way to a surplus. Well, in all of these domains, the work of CPE is quite crucial. The task of the PR industry is straightforward. It's to delude and confuse the public for very good reasons, so as to drive them in the desired direction, as Bernays put it. And the task of CPE is the opposite. It's to reverse the process, to create an informed public capable of making rational decisions. That's a monumental choice, a task. It's facing a huge juggernaut, but it's necessary to overcome the impact of the huge propaganda offensives that are manifested very dramatically during the electoral cycle, but are going on all the time. The public has to learn how the economic system works, has to become aware of, informed about economic realities, and crucially, it has to understand that there are alternatives. An illustration is a recent publication of Perry, the Political Economy Research Institute here, which found that, interesting study, which found that that banks and non-financial corporations are holding about $1.5 trillion in excess cash, meaning excess beyond what they need for safety needs. And it went on to show how these resources can be put to work and how they could create 19 million jobs. That would substantially overcome the fundamental problem in the society, not to speak of the human benefits, the millions of lives saved. The living wage campaign is another example. Others are publications of the kind mentioned, the Field Guide, the economic policy for the 99% designed for Occupy, workshops, other programs, educational materials. In those ways, the center helps bring to the public the idea that an economy can be designed to satisfy human needs, not profit for the few. In today's world, very few. It doesn't have to be that way, but the only way it can change if an informed and engaged public becomes dedicated to the task, that would make a difference. That's why there are such massive efforts to prevent it. And that's the task that the center has carried out successfully for now a quarter of a century, with much more to do as powerful forces mobilize to drive the country to disaster. Thanks.